Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you to the Beinecke Library and to Jennifer Coggins as well, who's helping us on the technical side of things. And as you will see in a moment, I owe quite a debt of gratitude to the work that Michael and his colleagues have done around the 1831 failed attempt to start an HBCU in New Haven. And so I'm going to start with that background for understanding a little bit about the story of Canterbury and Prudence Crandall. Prudence Crandall is the official state heroine of Connecticut, and that is generally a good thing. But the reason that the school is important is not only about her and her bravery. It is fundamentally a story about Black women inspiring a white woman to do the right thing, and then Black men and white men working together to help propel that school into the national headlines and school the nation. Canterbury comes at a pivotal moment in the history of immediate abolition. And in its brief life, from fall of 1832, when the first Black student, Sarah Harris, was admitted, until September of 1834, when the school had to close due to vigilante violence, a lot changed in the abolition movement. And to chart that change, I'm going to start with 1831, which I firmly believe is the most important year in American history, because it's the year when the promise of American inclusiveness begins to be fulfilled, when we can see Black and white, men and women, and Native Americans too, although I don't touch on that here, become involved as political actors. And it is important to consider that at that moment in 1831, 3 of the 4 main groups involved, Black men, Black women, and white women, had no realistic hopes of voting. The way they were going to make a political impact had to be outside of the voting booth. So in 1831, William Lloyd Garrison launched The Liberator, famously on January 1st in Boston. He said that he would publish every week until the end of slavery, and indeed he kept the newspaper going until the end of 1865. What is less reported, and to me just as important, is that on January 8th, in his second issue, William Lloyd Garrison published David Walker's appeal, even though Garrison himself was not in full agreement with the call for the slaves to rise up against the masters. So this was a moment of true respect, the recognition of something that was intellectually important and worth wrangling with and discussing. It is a moment when these forces meet. Lydia Maria Child, who was one of the finest fiction authors and really a kind of domestic guru like a Martha Stewart of her time, joined the abolitionist movement early in 1831 as both a writer and editor. And she was, in many cases, boycotted by people who opposed her abolition work in later years, but she was willing to take that on. Of course, 1831 is also justly famous for Nat Turner's revolt in Southampton, Virginia, perhaps the best planned slave uprising of all of American history. It was defeated, unfortunately, by militias after 3 days. Nat Turner himself remained on the loose for a good 2 months, though. And it was during that moment that a Black woman, Maria Stewart, walked into the offices of Garrison's Liberator and asked him to publish her meditations, which included very strong statements about women, race, and class, and opened a new chapter in understanding the full dimension of the movement for not only abolition, but for ending racism. And somewhere in the midst of all of that, a young Black woman, a teenager, Mariah Davis, was living in Boston and moved to Canterbury, Connecticut to be close to her fiance, a man named Charles Harris. And the first job she was able to get in Canterbury was as a household helper to a young white woman, Prudence Crandall, who had set up a high school or an academy for women. At that time, no one felt it necessary to say white women. It was assumed. But Mariah Davis had the ability to change that. But let me go back to another 1831 event. The New Haven Manual Labor College, in which Connecticut failed to host the first, what would have been the first historically Black college. This was also a great moment of unity between Black men who had been abolitionists for a long time and the white immediatists like William Lloyd Garrison. Many of these people who were involved in the 1831 Manual Labor College were also going to be part of Canterbury later on. The proposed college famously was defeated, 700-4, but this is where the Beinecke comes in, because the recent work by Tobias Cropper, Charles Warner Jr., and Michael Moran, who introduced me, have made this story and the costs of this story far better known. And I urge you, if you have not already watched what could have been the video, please do go to YouTube after my talk and listen for that. This defeat, in its overwhelming nature, in its connection to the Nat Turner Uprising, in many dimensions, it was a high water mark for proponents of colonization. The idea that free Blacks should be repatriated to an Africa that most of them didn't know. It did, however, set the stage for Canterbury, which is why I started with saying that Canterbury is pivotal, because it changes that direction. So Mariah Davis moves to northeastern Connecticut, Windham County, known colloquially as the land of steady habits or the quiet corner. But it was going to get very noisy. And it turned out to, in fact, be an area that would yield many fine white abolitionists to the cause, as well as many important African-American abolitionists, especially in relation to the school. Canterbury, Brooklyn, and Plainfield, which I've circled here, were the centers of activity during the Academy controversy. The closest large cities were to the south of them in New London County, Norwich and New London, both of which had seafaring occupations connected to them. And seafaring occupations were one of the professions that was open to Black men. So there were some small free Black populations in the cities and scattered throughout Windham County. What happens next is sometime in the summer and fall of 1832. It starts with Mariah Davis, that teenage woman who had come down from Boston and taken a job as the household helper at Crandall School. She started to provide Crandall with copies of The Liberator. Presumably, Mariah Davis herself had read The Liberator as an active African-American person in Boston. She would have known about it because it was essentially functioning as a kind of Black community newspaper in Boston. But also, she was her fiance, Charles Harris, his father, William Harris, was the local agent for The Liberator, a job he took on in the immediate aftermath of the Nat Turner Uprising. So here we have Mariah Davis bringing this incendiary paper into her place of employ and leaving copies for the teacher to read. We do not know if she did this actively, like presenting them to Crandall and said, here, I think you should read this, or if she did it passively, like just leave it sitting around. But it was a brave thing for a young woman to do. But she must have had an inkling that it was worth at least testing the mettle of Prudence Crandall and seeing what she was made of. This vetting of Prudence Crandall by Mariah Davis was successful enough that Mariah told her future sister-in-law, Sarah Harris, I think you can approach her. Because Crandall's initial response to reading The Liberator was, I saw in its pages truly what was happening to the people of color, both in slavery and here in the North. So Sarah Harris approached Crandall and asked if she could become a student at the school so that she would be able to teach other African Americans. Crandall did not say yes at first, She apparently was, Sarah Harris had to ask more than once, but she did. She persisted, and Crandall at that point engaged in what's called talismanic biblical reading. It's a practice that many Christian communities, especially Protestant ones, have participated in, where you open the Bible to a random passage. And she opened to Ecclesiastes 4:1. And let me just say, I don't think that was it didn't strike me as being fortuitous, because there is no book of the Bible as depressing as Ecclesiastes. It is world weary. It says there's nothing new under the sun. It posits that life could be meaningless. And yet, out of there, she happened upon Ecclesiastes 4:1. So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. And so Crandall took that as a sign that she was to admit Sarah Harris immediately, which she did. Just want to point out the portrait here of Prudence Crandall, which is a beautiful portrait by the famed artist Francis Alexander, who also came from the Quiet Corner. But most of the commission for this painting was given by an African-American man, John Bowers. And Bowers, I consider to be the start of the Black memory of what happened in Canterbury and with Crandall. So these three women spark each other. It's what my friend Lou Turner called a luminous moment when I first told him the story. Because education concerns human reason itself. And once that flame is lit, once we're co-developing our reason together, the women are sparked further and they move into even more transformative change. So these three women cast a stone into a pool of complacency, largely white complacency around them, resulting in more ripples than scholars had documented previously. And one way that I characterize my book is that it's a microscopic look at a movement for social change, the abolition movement, near its inception, and how the addition of new forces and new passions, in this case, young women, helped to change the narrative. The white parents of the students who were attending Crandall School did not respond well to the admission of Sarah Harris as a student. They had no complaints against Sarah Harris per se. She was a respectable member of a respectable family, but the idea of an academy was to bring prestige to the village, not to conduct a social experiment. And the goal of the academy was not training in social justice, according to the white parents. It was to help their daughters get their MRS degree. So the parents objected. First, it was the mother saying, you have to withdraw her at once. Then the selectmen of the town. And Crandall realized that this tide against her was going to hurt her school financially. And so she decided to try another plan. And it's important for me in this Women's History Month that this was a woman-initiated plan, in much the same way that I think the school starts from the three women coming together. It was Crandall herself who had the idea, which she wrote to Garrison about and said, do you think there would be enough families in the Northeast that I could have my school filled with only African-American students? She met Garrison in Boston. He not only agreed, but he quickly came to trust Crandall and gave her a list of contacts, primarily in Providence and New York City. Crandall went from Garrison in Boston immediately down to Providence, where she met with another woman, Elizabeth Hammond, who was a widow who kept a boarding house. And of course, if you're the keeper of a boarding house in that day and age, you have to be respectable or the boarding house will be taken for something else. Thus, I think it noteworthy that this first prospective parent that Crandall deals with not only trusts her and entrusts two of her daughters to Crandall, but she also takes Crandall around to meet all of the other Black families with daughters of a suitable age in Providence. Even more daring was when Prudence Crandall went alone to New York City, where she met with many of the same Black ministers who had helped to get the New Haven Manual Labor College proposal started. So Peter Williams Jr., the great editor, Reverend Samuel Cornish, and the Reverend Theodore Wright, among many others. Quite bold for a young, white, unmarried woman to go to New York City and meet with these Black ministers in 1833. What's even more impressive, though, is that she won their trust as well. We have a very large number of students that come from New York City, the largest identifiable group coming from among the parishioners of Peter Williams Jr.'s Episcopal Church, St. Philip's. The result of this was one of my favorite documents of the abolitionist era. This is the advertisement published in the Liberator and in other newspapers for the school when it was set to reopen for Black women in April of 1833. The first part is voiced in Crandall's own words, and she says that her school will be open for the reception of young ladies and little misses of color. Not only were these terms of respect at that time, which were generally reserved for white women only, but here Crandall is saying that she knows that these Black students are young ladies and little misses of color. They don't need to show up and prove it first. So she had really taken a great step towards being anti-racist and understanding the equality of all people. The list for endorsers is also quite interesting. It is both practical and political. And again, those of you who are familiar with the New Haven story will notice a lot of overlap. No endorser's race is specified. The names are arranged by their location, not by race. And every Black man on this list has a title before his name, either Reverend or Mr. And I've given you the list there of the African-American names. So we have 8 Black names and 7 white names. It's a practical advertisement as well, because obviously those Black leaders are the ones who are going to be able to recruit students. So here we see the abolitionist interracial male network being made visible in the cause of Black women's higher education, because this was a high school. This was not about basic literacy skills. This was about getting enough education to be a teacher yourself. And this is also a few years before any colleges are open to women at all. So it's the highest form of education available to women at that time. So this is a busy slide. I've never bought into that thing that PowerPoint ought to have just a little bit of information on each slide. So you can use your best conference manners and read it as you go. So from that initial ripple in the pool that the 3 women create, that spark among women goes from Black women to white women. And I use the philosophic construct of my friend and colleague, Emily Culpepper, who talks about philosophia, the wisdom that is nurtured among women. But from that philosophia, it goes out to the parents and the families and the other students who are going to show up. That male abolitionist network is also activated. As I mentioned, the white male and Black male abolitionists growing from that New Haven base and willing to try another Connecticut experiment. Lydia Mariah Child, who I brought up in 1833 in her appeal on behalf of those Americans who are called Africans, she wrote about how New Haven and Canterbury were connected, how the demon of prejudice girds himself for the battle the moment Negro colleges and high schools are alluded to. The Crandall legal team was led by William Ellsworth, a son of Oliver Ellsworth, one of the chief justices of the Supreme Court in the era immediately after the Revolution and the Constitution. And Ellsworth's arguments for Black citizenship were so strong that they had to be refuted by Roger Taney in the infamous Dred Scott decision, and then they had to be reaffirmed in Brown v. Board in the 1950s. Good arguments, shouldn't have taken 120 years for them to become the law of the land. But at least he made them. And then there was growing local white support. The Benson family, who are going to be Garrison's future in-laws, were one pole of that. The Burleigh family, who I'll talk more about in a moment, were editors of the Unionist paper, which was the Connecticut's first immediate abolition newspaper, published in Brooklyn, Connecticut. And two members of the Burleigh family, Mary and William, were co-teachers with Crandall and her sister. They formed a Brooklyn female anti-slavery society that included, among others, Olive Gilbert, who would later become the first amanuensis for Sojourner Truth. And they founded the Plainfield Anti-Slavery Society, the men did, where many fine abolitionists came through, including James Monroe, who was Lincoln's ambassador to Brazil and helped to push along the cause of abolition in that country. So the anti-racist legacy of the Burleigh family is long, and I have an independent digital humanities project about it. But everything that the Burleigh family did was launched by their involvement in Canterbury. And so it's a very clean case of seeing how, when one person takes a stand, others are going to hear that and respond to it and follow through. So I urge you to take a look at that. And I'm also happy to say that I got to view some issues of the Charter Oak at the Beinecke Library as I was preparing this project. So the actual school lasts from 1833 to 34. And what is remarkable is that actual learning did take place despite the theater going on around these women and their teachers. They knew that they had to be supporting the cause of abolition and anti-slavery. They got to watch themselves in the newspapers, and also there were laws passed against the school which put the students on trial, literally. So there were a host of distractions, and yet real learning took place. And the evidence for this comes in the later lives of the students. More than 10 students became abolitionist activists that we've been able to trace, and at least 6, probably 7 or 8, became teachers themselves. I always like to leave this slide up for a moment. This is, to the best of our knowledge, all of the students who attended. The students protected each other, and their teachers did too, by giving them a cloak of anonymity. This meant that the vigilante mobs who hung outside the school on a regular basis, the boy ruffians and the more dangerous adults, would not be able to yell out the students' names and have that power over them. Most of the students' names we know come from later memoirs, some from obituaries, some from letters, and most of them, though, are from the trial transcripts, where it was the intention of those who had written the Black Law to make sure that the students had to testify against their own education. The cruelty was the point. I've marked these with those who we know had active careers after the school, and those for whom we have some evidence of their lives after the school. But I urge you to take a look, and if a name leaps out at you, or you want to undertake some deep research, there is work to be done. Just as my book was going to print, I was in fact holding the proofs. Evidence emerged of a new student who none of us had known about, from a very prominent family. Elizabeth Webb, she's there under the Pennsylvania residence, whose brother Frank Webb was a very prominent novelist, and Frank's wife was a regular presence on the abolitionist circuit as a reciter, an orator. So having Elizabeth Webb turn out to be one of the students was fascinating, and we found it because there was a letter that she had written to Crandall about what was happening in the suffrage movement in DC in the 1870s. So just remarkable connections, but there are still plenty of discoveries to be made. And this list has grown by about 1/3 since I started my research, not all by my finding them. Many fine scholars have been participating in this truly group effort. Sarah Harris and Prudence Crandall remained lifelong friends. And it's interesting what they both say in 1833. They were very much self-conscious agents of change. Sarah Harris writing, "Our cause will be the means of arousing the nations to their duty with respect to the condition of our colored population and be the means of allaying the prejudice of Americans." Even if that wasn't true when she wrote it, it didn't allay prejudice yet. Racism is still with us. But the goal and the sentiment are beautiful. And this letter, too, was lost until an enterprising local historian in New London, Tom Such, found it. In a letter to Simeon Jocelyn, a major player in the New Haven Manual Labor College, Prudence Crandall wrote, "I have put my hand to the plow and I will never, no, never look back." And that turns out to be true. In the last letter she ever wrote to Garrison's children in 1889, she said she was writing from Kansas and she's 86 at that time. And she says, "Every week I make sure to read something in the newspapers that are written by the colored people themselves so I know what they are thinking." That's good anti-racist practice. So the students and teachers remained steadfast in their dedication to learning. And I think some of this was the exhilaration of a community that was engaged in transformation while they knew they didn't have the luxury of time. There are things that had to happen. But I contend that a school should be judged by its alumni and their impact, not only by its longevity. And this comment about William Burleigh was written by one of the students after the school was forced to close. "First, she praises her fellow students. I have found among them simple manners and intelligent minds, and there, if anywhere, love was without dissimulation. My teacher was ever kind. With him I saw religion not merely adopted as an empty form, but a living, all-pervading principle of action. He lived like those who seek a better country." What were the students learning? Well, we know they were reading the abolitionist press because they were published in it to some extent. So they probably were reading what they had sent in anonymously to the Liberator when it came out. We also know that that was a regular practice in Black communities to be reading the abolitionist press. One example of this was William Lloyd Garrison's Thoughts on African Colonization, the first half of which is his essay against it, and the second half of which is the publication of all of the resolutions that African American communities had passed against colonization. And in doing that, every single student who would pick up a copy of this would know the names and probably personally know some of the authors of what was in the second half of this book. The students were also studying philosophy, and they were participating as their own citizenship and right to education were on trial. The Black Law was passed that made it illegal to harbor out-of-state Blacks for purposes of education. And Crandall was arrested under that and had to spend a night in jail. And while in jail, far from being passive, like she is shown in that picture, just kind of staring out the window wistfully, far from that, she writes a letter to the Liberator editor, who was someone filling in for Garrison, who was away. She writes, "Will you please send your Liberator the term of 6 months to Lydia Congdon, Jewett City, Connecticut. She having paid to me for your agent, Mr. William Harris, the sum of $1. Do not fail to send her one next week." So here's Prudence Crandall in prison, taking the time to ensure that a recent Black woman subscriber, with whom she dealt personally, will receive her copy of the Liberator. She also thereby reveals that she's in regular contact with Sarah Harris's father, William. To borrow a leftist idiom, Prudence Crandall was performing movement work while she was in jail, growing the alliance she had helped actualize with her school. Even the connection with Anna Benson, who volunteered to stay with Crandall overnight, can be seen as an example of coalition building. So in her brief jailhouse epistle, Crandall interacts by name with a Black man, white male allies, including May and George Benson Sr., who bail her out, and a Black woman, and shares her cell with a white woman. So in much the same way that the student had said that William Burleigh was trying to imagine a better country, I would claim Crandall envisioned and actualized a different kind of America in that moment, one where I would like to live. So The school, in its brief life, had to deal with 4 separate trials. The ones that I've highlighted here with a black background were the ones where we have extensive record of the students speaking. And in both of those cases, the jury was a hung jury. The students were so convincing in their comportment, in their speech, in their understanding of what was happening, that they won over the reporter from the Connecticut Post who was covering the trials. In 1834, there was an arson trial, which I'll return to in a moment. That time, they helped to get a black man off of what was a railroaded attempt to frame him. And yet, in the portrayal of the trial, we don't see the students. So I put a few faces in there because they are the ones in a perilous situation. They're being set up to damage their own education. They are of an average age of 16 and a half, not the age that is best able to avoid an eye roll or a sigh. And yet they do it. They're disciplined, they're poised, they're intelligent, they're savvy, they get it, and they win the day both times they are allowed to speak. What was the violence like? It was constant. This is from a student who wrote, "The Canterburyans are savage. They will not sell Miss Crandall an article at their shops. My ride from Hartford to Brooklyn was very unpleasant, being made up of blackguards. I came on foot from here to Brooklyn. But the happiness I enjoy here pays me for all. The place is delightful. All that is wanting to complete the place is civilized men. Last evening, the news reached us that the new law had passed. The bell rang and a cannon was fired for half an hour. Where is justice? In the midst of all this, Miss Crandall is unmoved." But the vigilante violence just escalated. Students were often refused medical attention, for instance. And there was cow dung placed in the water well, things like that. In January of 1834, an arson fire was set. Fortunately, Frederick Olney, a black man from New London, was visiting. He had spent many years at sea. He was a very strong young man. And one of the students noticed smoke in the room. Olney ran outside, saw where the fire was coming from, put it out. And for being the hero, he was arrested by the white authorities in Norwich a few days later. And so he was put on trial for having started the fire, when in fact he did not, and they were simply trying to evade whoever was responsible. The students knew everywhere that he had been at exactly the right time. They corroborated each other flawlessly. The jury, an all-white jury, of course, took 15 minutes to come back with a total acquittal. But the only known fatality was a black and white cat that was murdered, its fur placed over the fence in front of the school, to send a message that black and white would not be allowed to coexist in Canterbury. And that came in the midst of the hot summer of July and August of 1834, when there were many anti-abolitionist riots in New York and Philadelphia. So the students responded with this wonderful letter. This happened before the first trial. Again, I'll leave you to read this yourself, but I just want to point out at the end where it says, "Miss Crandall's instructions have been for us not to indulge in angry feelings towards our enemies. With unceasing and untiring earnestness has she pled with us to forgive them. And now let us try to abide by her counsel and feel at peace with all men." And there's a real tension there, because let's face it, nonviolence is a hard practice. And there's a tension about whether that is the best way to behave. And a few years later, one of those Canterbury women, Julia Williams, was married to Henry Highland Garnett, one of the leading African-American abolitionists and thinkers in the 19th century. Garnett credits Julia Williams, his wife, with being the only person to preview his famous 1843 speech in Buffalo that urged the slaves to rebel physically against their oppressors. When he was questioned about this by Maria Chapman, who was filling in as editor of The Liberator, he replied very angrily. He said, "The only person who read it was my wife." I didn't get advice from any black men or white men about this. He credits her. And so it shows that she had gotten critical thinking skills as a result of her education. She wasn't following the same principles that had been in place in Canterbury. And that to me is a sign of a successful education, not carbon copies. The end of the school in 1834 is not the final word of Canterbury, not at all. That's the mistake that people made both at the time and later. There's a real story we can follow out, and this is where I am at a tremendous advantage compared to my colleagues at the Beinecke who were working on the 1831 college. This school existed for 2 years. I have a list of alumni. I have names that can be charted out in this era. The story of Canterbury is not a story of Prudence Crandall alone. And I'm happy to say that Prudence Crandall never told it that way. A single hero like Crandall rests on a very uneasy slope that's going to slide right into being a white savior. But Canterbury was not about one white savior. It was a force multiplier of many heroes. Black and white, male and female, young and old, it stands as multidimensional and prismatic, and therefore a social movement, a movement for change. And the three women on the cover indicate that. Sarah Harris is on the left. This is a picture of her from a much older age. She married George Fairweather, and they settled in Rhode Island, where their house became a regular stop on the abolitionist circuit. She had annual gift exchanges of fruitcakes with both Frederick Douglass's family and William Lloyd Garrison's family. She was a known hostess to many important abolitionists in the area. And she now has a dormitory at University of Rhode Island named after her, Fairweather Hall. The woman on the far right is her sister, Mary Harris, who marries an educator, Pelham Williams, who was active in a number of Black conventions in Connecticut and also in education in both New Haven and New London. And she and Pelham Williams moved to New Orleans as soon as the Union has secured New Orleans from the Confederacy in 1863. They are involved in helping to set up the HBCU of Strait University, and also the preparatory school that goes with it. And then Maritza Lyons in the middle is the first of the memory bearers. She was not a student at the school, but the niece of one of the students. And she writes the first two capsule biographies of people who were at the school, of Sarah Harris and Elizabeth Smith. But it doesn't end there. This was the last major slide. I'm not going to tell you all these stories because I want you to read the book. But when you start tracing out the descendants of the students, the legacy is remarkable. And my favorite story, because I'm a sports fan as well, is this man, Fritz Pollard Jr. One of the student, Amy Fenner, one of her granddaughters married Fritz Pollard Sr., who might be familiar to you if you know the NFL. He was in the NFL Hall of Fame. He was the first Black coach in the NFL before they segregated. His son, Fritz Pollard Jr., did play football as well, but Fritz Pollard Jr., who is a direct descendant of one of the students, instead became a track and field star. And he was so good, in fact, that he was part of the 1936 Olympic team, the Berlin Olympics of 1936, what was supposed to be Hitler's Olympics, but instead became the Jesse Owens Olympics, because Jesse Owens was indeed on the same team with Fritz Pollard Jr. And in one of the events where Jesse Owens won the gold, Fritz Pollard got the bronze. And to be doing that in the face of a growing fascism is quite an achievement, and I would hope what America stands for then and now. So I mentioned the Burley Project and the Unionist Unified, which is my putting the Unionists back together well as I could. Those are both online projects that build on this legacy of Canterbury in terms of the white abolitionist movement. But I want to say at this point a big thank you to Michael Morand and his associates who have helped to bring the story of the 1831 failed labor college back into the public view. and also to all of you for being such a patient audience. And I hope that we can now go out and change the world, even if we start modestly, as these women did. Thanks so much.